Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joe Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
What does it mean to be a good listener? How do you know if you're a good listener? And how do you know if people around you in your life are good listeners? One of the things that I think Antonia and I believe is that we're podcasters, right? So we talk a lot about a lot of stuff. But one of the things that really helps change the world and help humans get along better and move the needle forward as society is the ability for humans to listen and understand each other. And it seems like it might be a dying art.
Yeah, well, all of our technologies have been built on the ability to cross-pollinate ideas. We are all smarter when we're able to do idea exchange because we can build on each other's concepts and ideas and find the weaknesses and add creativity and insight. And that only happens when we have the ability to listen as well as speak, right? So I think a lot of focus is put on the art of persuasion and the art of speaking. And in the modern world, it feels like, well, if there's nobody to listen, then what does it matter if you've built the art of persuasion? Now, persuasion is intended to incentivize other people to listen, but that still means that they have to have the ability to listen, like they have to have the skill built. And I think one of the challenges that we experience is that, in particular with social media, is that if you see writing and communicating through text or writing as a form of speaking, then it's really challenging for us to truly listen to people on the other side because we have a tendency to dehumanize them. We are programmed to think in terms of sound bites, and we're programmed to think in terms of very small amounts of information representing huge, massive ideas. And so somebody will do a simple soundbite, make America great again. And we will glob onto that concept a whole bunch of other concepts, maybe an entire worldview to that. And so since we're trained to think in terms of sound bites and then pattern recognize extraordinary amounts of information, then when a person has a sound bite around them and then tries to offer maybe something that's a distinction or a nuance from what is normally packaged with that sound bite, we're not willing to listen to them. We think that we already know what their worldview is. And so listening is where that's where we take in those nuances. That's where we don't just think in terms of sound bites and make huge assumptions. And it's when we stop dehumanizing other people, because if we're truly listening to them, then we have to see them as a valid speaker of information. And so listening is becoming more and more challenging as we program ourselves to not listen. We're really programming ourselves to not listen to other people. We're programming ourselves to make assumptions, wild, huge speculative leaps on when the other person is coming from. And so the art of persuasion is extremely important, but the art of listening right now might be even more crucial for people to develop. And the art of rehumanizing speakers in order to actually see where they're coming from. Because as we mentioned, if we lose the ability to listen, then we lose the ability to cross-pollinate, and we lose the ability to be creative with each other in both consumer and social technologies.
When I think about this, you mentioned social media and how much information is coming at all of us so fast. If you look at this almost like, I'm going to zoom way out for a second, we had almost professional listeners for us as far as this idea goes, like the news and things that are happening and all this. Journalists were professional listeners. They would listen to all the things going on in the world. They'd summarize it for us and they would write articles and things. But now all of us can produce content, media, audio, text. So there's a lot to listen to, way more than ever before. So there's so much noise that it's hard to listen anymore. We just inundated with all this information constantly. So we're losing our ability to slow down and actually listen to other humans.
Yeah. I think the skill of listening should be developed in person, though. And we keep getting on and on about this at Personality Hacker, that we're a digital company. And so most of our interactions that happen with our audience are virtual. They're digital. It's through social media, or it's through, say, a podcast where we time bind this information and then upload it, and then you, the listener, consumes it later. There's a disconnected piece. And so we've been focusing on things like meetups. Whenever we travel someplace, we try to schedule a meetup, and we're going to be going the direction of more live events. And it's because we need to be more energetically in each other's space. We feel like that's really important and kind of a missing element of the modern world. And also, when we go out to dinner, you and I, Joel, we notice that couples will be on their phones more than they're talking to each other out to dinner. Or if we're in a public space, it looks like everybody's doing like the iPod prayer, right? They're all bent over their phones. So when we are energetically in each other's space, it's almost like we're forgetting how to engage with each other. And so this idea of listening, I think the highest leverage thing we can do is get back into a space where when we are physically in somebody else's presence, we can have an energetic interchange and a conceptual interchange by conversing and listening to each other, and not just going through that digital platform and then running the risk of dehumanizing each other. Like, it's really easy to carry over our relationships with how we communicate with other people online into our real world because we're so everything's so digital. So I think with listening and developing the art of listening, I think being present and really taking the opportunities when we are with each other to conscientiously develop this skill by being with another person and leveraging the amazing sort of alchemical equation that happens when we are idea generating in person and not just online, and maybe pulling back from this idea of sound bites. Like, when you're with somebody physically, you can't help but humanize them because you see that they're a person and you read their emotions and you see how things are impacting them. And so if everything's just down to a soundbite, then you know, well, this person is more complex than just that. So maybe they have more to say here. And if we can't seem to shift out of that sort of, that soundbite mentality and back into a more nuanced understanding of each other's thought processes, then it becomes more obvious in those real-time conversations because the other person will give us a look of bafflement. And they'll be like, well, no, that's not what I'm saying at all. And they can just keep saying that over and over. That's not what I'm saying at all. And eventually, after about 7 or 8 of them, maybe that penetrates and goes, oh, well, maybe they're talking about something different than I'm assuming through my maybe terrible pattern recognition.
So we all have these people in our lives, and we might be these people ourselves. Why don't we listen sometimes as humans? There's 3 things that come to my mind. And Antonia, we're generating this content in real time right now. So this is what came up for me, and maybe you have something to add to this list. But I have 3 basic reasons that I can identify why some people have a hard time listening. So we're talking about in-person listening. You're with another person. They're talking. The first reason I believe is insecurity. So someone's talking, and they're talking about a subject matter that you just don't feel competent around, to engage around. They're talking about something that might put you out of your wheelhouse that you feel competent to speak on. And so you don't listen because it puts you in an insecure frame. I think that's when a lot of people can find themselves resisting listening carefully because now they have to give a response. They have to respond to what's being talked about, and they don't feel like it's in their wheelhouse at all. So I think that's number 1. Number 2, I think people avoid truths that if they listen carefully, certain truths about who they are going to come out. And so they resist listening carefully because if they hear something that makes sense to them or resonates with them on a deep level, now they might have to make a behavior change based on something they listened to, right? So by keeping the listening filters shut off or not being a good listener, now I don't have to see things about myself or hear things about myself that I've been avoiding. So it gives me a mechanism to distance myself from it.
Right. Not even just behavior change, but it might just knock over the first domino of some cognitive dissonance. And now they have to question a bunch of stuff or maybe everything.
Certainly. I mean, we've had listeners on our podcast email in and talk to us about, well, you said this one thing and it made me feel all these ways, and so you should change your message, because we got them in a framework where they were listening and they heard something they've been trying to avoid for a long time, and now we get a comment back that, you're whatever, this didn't resonate with me or hit me right because it doesn't line up with what I want to believe about myself. I'm avoiding this thing. I mean, this is the subtext I'm adding to it. Obviously, this isn't what they say. This is how I'm seeing it. And it's an avoidance strategy. So we don't listen because we're trying to avoid something. And the third one I came up with is overwhelm, like we talked about with the social media stuff. We're just inundated with so much these days. Maybe you're a mom and you go and you got to talk to the soccer coach and they're trying to tell you all the details about the soccer team and the trouble with your son. And then you've got your husband calling you from work and telling you other stuff. And then you've got your social groups you're a part of, your friend groups, or like you've got all these things you have to listen to and pay attention to, all these details to manage. And so we literally can't listen to all this stuff anymore. It's just too much coming at us. Our lives are so complex that we're just overwhelmed. And so we're going through our day trying to execute and output and make things happen. And by definition, if you're executing and outputting, you can't input. You can't slow down enough to have those long, rambling conversations and be a careful or active or engaged listener. You just don't have the space in your life. So those three things came up for me. Did anything come up for you, Antonia, as far as other reasons why people have a hard time listening?
Yeah, I'd add a fourth one, which is boredom. I think it's hard for us to listen when we're bored. And I don't know this to be true, but it seems to me like the modern world has made it so that we can be entertained at every moment of every day if we want to be. And so we have lost the ability to be bored or like have a tolerance for boredom. And we have a much lower threshold for what we find boring. So if a person is talking about something that we haven't already marked as intrinsically interesting to us, then our minds wander and we want to be entertained. And so if the person's talking about something that's not entertaining to us, then we have a hard time listening. And so I think boredom is, it's not just on the speaker. Boredom is also on us as a listener. Like, can we find what they're talking about interesting because we find the person interesting? Or maybe they have something to say within that topic that is interesting. Now, I mean, granted, some people are less interesting speakers than others, and those people are easier to be bored around. And so it's not like you're supposed to find everything interesting all the time. But I do believe that our threshold for boredom is much, much, much lower than it's ever been in any other time period in history, right? Like before, during a time period where you weren't connected to everything all the time and had access to literally all the information in the world and perpetual theater, right? And games and things to read and people to engage with. You know, if you were a farmer and you were like half a mile from your neighbor and your neighbor happens to walk by and you found them to be an incredibly boring person, but this is the first new person you've seen in 3 days, then, you know, it's like food always tastes better when you're really hungry, and conversation always tastes really good when you haven't been able to converse in a long time. So I think our threshold for boredom is also an influencer to why we have a tendency to have difficulty listening.
So I think those are some reasons why people resist. I thank you for that. I think that is a good one. I think boredom is definitely a piece of it. And I also look at listening in kind of two different frameworks. There might be more, but again, this is coming up for me as we talk about it. I look at listening in responsive framework or an active framework. So a responsive listening frame or an active listening frame. And what I mean by responsive is talking to the soccer coach, the mom that takes the kid to the soccer team, and the soccer coach has to dispel information. And so that mom has to be in a responsive framework to listen to what's happening, take the information, and do something with it. Or let's say, you know, a man comes home from work, from a long day of work or whatever, and he has some emotional issues he's been dealing with that day, and he is starting to articulate to the family, and his children and his wife maybe are in a responsive frame of listening to the emotional situations he's been through that day. So in general, basically, responsive listening is listening you have to do to either do something like get something accomplished, get the information you need, be empathetic to another person expressing their emotions. You know, you ever heard this whole phrase where someone's telling you their problems, or I mean, not telling you necessarily, the listener, you listening their problems, but this whole idea of like, I don't need you to solve my problem, I just need you to listen. This is a responsive listening. It's just being able to listen just for its own sake and being able to be responsive to whatever's happening. So either it's input, like it's information exchange, or it's responsive listening. It's like an input of listening, and it's almost, I wouldn't call it a requirement, but it's an expectation we have as humans, especially if you're in a relationship. Like, Antonio, if I have a hard day like that, you know, the dad coming home from work, right? Let's say I come home and I've got a hard day. My expectation is that I tell you something and you're a responsive listener to what is being told to you. And I think this is the framework where most listening happens for most people. Most people are responsive listeners. They're not active listeners. They're responsive. In other words, they always let the other person that's doing the talking lead how they're going to listen. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you kind of lost me a little bit with the mom talking to the soccer coach, but you mean like the soccer coach has to dispense information about how her child is doing in soccer, and so therefore she has to be responsive to the information he's trying to give her. Yeah,
the difference between, so responsive versus active, how I see it, again, this is coming off the top of my head. Responsive is she shows up to the soccer game and, oh, hey, Mrs. Smith, I got to tell you about next week's, you know, whatever schedule, and also little Billy's having trouble because he keeps kicking this other kid in the shin. Can you help us fix this? And she has to be responsive to that. Versus active listening, which is her seeking something out and saying, Coach, can I I've noticed Billy's coming home really angry after all the games. Can I schedule an appointment with you on Saturday? And I'll get to what I see active listening in a minute. But that'd be more of an active frame where she is the one directing what she's listening for. Does that make sense?
Okay, yeah.
So then on the other side of this, I see active listening, which is much more directed. And this is where I think to be a good listener, you switch from a responsive framework to an active framework where you're emotionally and mentally invested in what you're listening for. So as your spouse comes home or your partner comes home from work and they start to articulate some of the challenges they've had all day, some of the emotions they're feeling, there's two ways to activate this or be active in it. One is to ask more questions and just continue to listen. So you're still in somewhat of a responsive way, but you're asking, so why did that make you feel that way? How's that? It doesn't have to go to like solving problems, right? It doesn't have to be a problem solving frame, but it's definitely taking control of the listening. You're actively listening and you're also rephrasing back something to somebody. If you've ever been with somebody, obviously, that they say, and I do this all the time now, I think Nee on our team does this well, our COO. And I think this is a strategy that I've seen. Actually, you do this as well too, Antonio. A lot of people that I'm around do this, but it's like, so what I hear you saying is, and they repeat back something somebody said. So this idea between responsive and active listening, I believe, and this is where I get around the idea of boredom. I get around the idea of insecurity, avoidance, and overwhelm. Because when I'm listening from a personal standpoint, I take control of my listening. And I direct the conversation in ways that aren't boring for me. So if somebody's boring, I take an active listening role and I try to wrap up what they're saying that's boring, and I ask questions and move the conversation in a way that's engaging for me so I'm not bored. If I feel overwhelmed, I take control of the situation. I help direct it through an active listening frame. And if I'm trying to avoid something, well, that's probably one that I bet you that I have a bigger struggle with, even in an active listening framework. I bet you I still try to avoid things that I want to hear. I bet that's one that a lot of us have a hard time with. But also this idea of insecurity, they're talking about a subject I don't know. Let's say I'm hanging out with some like stockbrokers in New York. I don't know much about stockbroking. And now I feel a little insecure. Like, wow, I'm not part of this group. These people have a competency I don't have. So instead of just be responsively listening, I start actively asking questions and I listen for the answers. And it's a great way for me to gain the competency so I don't feel incompetent anymore. And I can just admit, hey, I don't know what you're talking about. Can you explain that for me? They explain it. It still doesn't make sense. Unpack that like I'm a 5-year-old. Tell me what you mean by that. I'm actively listening for the responses back. So it's taking control of the listening. And again, this is just my personal way that I see listening. And I move through the world trying to be in active listening mode as much as possible. And it's made my life so much better than simply being in responsive listening mode.
To prep for this podcast, I went and looked up some information on what makes a good listener, what makes a great listener. And I ran into an article in...
You prepared?
Kind of. I mean,
You cheated and I'm kidding.
It's not a manuscript in front of me. I just... I just try to get a lot of information in my head, and then maybe when I vomited it out, something good will come.
What you say will be more wise than me because I just made it all up off the top of my head.
Well, the fact that you were able to come up with a framework off the top of your head is an impressive feat. And I mean, I do that sometimes too, but also I like to feed my brain with relevant information before we start a podcast. And one of the articles I ran into was from Harvard Business Review. I don't actually remember what the name of the article was. It was like how to be a great listener, or what great listeners do, or something to that effect. And because I was looking for markers of it. And basically they indicated like the list of 4 things they mentioned were effectively what you're describing as active listening. The first thing they said that a lot of people make the mistake of is that you're supposed to be completely silent while somebody's talking. That's a marker of a good listener, but they disagreed with that. They said that the marker of a great listener is somebody who asks questions to promote discovery and insight. So you're not just being quiet, right, and blinking at the person who's talking. You're engaged with them, and you're asking questions that indicate that you're with them. And then the questions you ask open up the dialogue even further to get more insight or more discovery from them, or because they either have the information or your question triggered something, more inside of them. And so now you guys are idea generating. The second one was interactions that build self-esteem. And I was like, I wonder how the interaction builds self-esteem. And they mentioned that when the speaker feels supported. So it's not just a matter of listening and then asking them questions, but you also, you listen in a way that conveys confidence in them. So you have an interested look on your face and you secure the perimeter. So if somebody comes up and interrupts you, you say, hey, can you hang tight for a second? Because I'm talking to this person about something, that's important or interesting or whatever. And so they feel supported by you because you're so interested in what they have to say that you'll make sure that you have a space for their conversation and the things that they're talking about. So securing the perimeter would be something that builds confidence in what they're talking about, because what they're talking about is important enough to you that you'll mitigate disruption. The third one is cooperative conversation. And this is kind of what you're talking about, which is that you have a feedback mechanism to them that flows smoothly and it's not filled with defensiveness. It's meant to, as the first one with asking questions, it's meant to promote more insight, but it also is designed to make sure that they know you're in cooperation with them, that you have a shared goal of insight and truth, right? As opposed to you're just looking for ways to, tear down their argument. And they mentioned that great listeners, it's not like they're always just nodding and saying, yeah, I totally agree. A great listener will also disagree and challenge assumptions, but it's not for competitiveness. It's not in a competitive frame. It's not because you're trying to win the debate. It's that, the two of you are trying to get to a place where you both, that you're both smarter for the conversation or that you're better for the conversation. And the last one was make suggestions. And they said this one's kind of tough. It's kind of tough because one of the things that people always accuse poor listeners of is you just want to solve the problem. You don't want to actually listen to me. And the article mentioned that if you do the rest of these, right, like you do all the other markers of being a great conversationalist, this one actually is like a cherry on top, and then it expands their perception of you as a great listener. And that is, instead of just trying to solve the problem, as it's traditionally seen, it's that you are making suggestions that help open up their frame based on asking questions that promoted discovery and insight, right? So if you've already promoted discovery and insight, and you've already secured the perimeter for them, and you've already indicated a cooperative spirit, and that you're going to, that you will challenge them, but only because you have a shared interest in getting to greater insight, then when you make suggestions, they feel like you're with them. And then that turns you into an even greater listener in their mind, because you tapped so well into their concept or thought or what they're dealing with, that they now feel like you are qualified to make suggestions, that you're not just stabbing in the dark or just trying to make it so that you don't have to listen to them anymore. You've already done all the active listening. And so now your suggestions like sort of turn you into this, this font of wisdom, and that you're with them. And I thought that was really interesting because most of the other articles, indicated things like eye contact, right? Or presence, right? Being really with them, which is super important, right? Presence, not checking your phone, not, that's all the other things would not be securing the perimeter. If you're easily distracted, or if you allow distractions to come in, then you're not securing the perimeter. So you want to be present with them, maintain eye contact, be, cooperative and nod when you understand what they're saying or when they're looking for feedback from you. And things like being humble and open-minded and empathetic and, mirroring their behavior. And all of those are really great. But I thought that the suggestions in the Harvard Business Review kind of put it to the next level. But there was one more suggestion that I read someplace that I thought was really important. And that was, a good listener is okay with being uncomfortable, right? And that's one of the things that you mentioned, is that sometimes we don't listen because we're being avoidant. We're afraid that they're going to say something that makes a point that we didn't want to hear. And so we're avoiding hearing what they say so that we don't have anything that triggers our dissonance or just makes us think about stuff we don't want to have to think about. But a really good or great listener is okay with being uncomfortable in behalf of the speaker, which I thought was really interesting. So the more you're able to get out of your comfort zone and listen to things that, challenge you or put you in a frame where you might be triggered, right? Like being able to be triggered, right? And holding space for that experience is actually a skill. And in the modern world, we make trigger warnings all the time, and we're always talking about safe spaces, and we're talking about all these things that make it so that nobody ever has to be uncomfortable. But it might be that our inability to deal with discomfort is part of why we're not able to cross-pollinate ideas very much.
So I have the question, like, this kind of begs the question. And the question is, what is the point of listening? Is it to get information transfer? I think I touched on that a little bit when I talked about responsive listening. Or is it to create an emotional connection with somebody? Or is it to idea generate? Or is it to, in other words, I could keep going and asking those questions like on a long list, right? And I think each situation is a little different, right? Even in the midst of those two broad categories of responsive listening or active listening, those are infinitely sliceable in all sorts of different configurations. And I just want to stay with a couple more principles here. And then I think we could also talk about some practical, like literal phrases someone could use or ideas in a listening, kind of down to the keep eye contact. But I think eye contact, I understand what they mean by that, but sometimes it's not. Like if you're sitting in a car next to somebody and you're both driving and your eyes are on the road, it's going to be hard to have eye contact, right? But you can still be a good listener in that context, or on an airplane or something. You're not always turned and looking directly at the person. Sometimes that advice doesn't always play to every situation. So it's more of a principle than anything, right? So let's mine out the gold from that principle. But in general principle, I think, again, from my standpoint, the role of an active listener, not just a responsive listener, is the role that I like to be, and I would encourage other people to be as well. That's my personal worldview and personal opinion. And in saying that, I think to be an active listener, to your point, Antonia, takes courage, because you don't know what someone's going to say that could trigger you or challenge you. So I think it takes courage. And I think it also, weirdly enough, comes down to a leadership framework, taking the lead on something. When you're listening in an active way, you basically are taking the lead for the interchange that's happening. And just like when we talk about personality types and cognitive functions, all of our personalities, we have a learning or perceiving function, and we have a decision-making or judging function that we all have in our personalities, right? So when you're a good listener, you're also a good talker. It's not that you're literally listening the entire 100% of the time. You also now know how to be a good conversationalist in general, right? That's part of it. And part of that is being a leader. And like you said, securing the perimeter, asking questions, directing the conversation. And most people, if you're listening to this, you probably have a lot of leadership framework, or you're at least attracted to that possibly in your life, right? But most people in the world don't see themselves as leaders. In fact, they don't take the lead on most things in their life. They're waiting for someone else to take the lead for them. And I bet you that when you're accused of being a good listener, often you're being accused of really taking control and helping frame the conversation, securing the parameter, and asking the questions or positing the ideas that keep it going in a way that builds towards something. And I would say that something is energy exchange and fun. Like you're having a good interchange with somebody, right? Like if you're both yelling at each other, you might be listening carefully, but you're both yelling. That's not very fun. So my assumption is if someone says that person's a good listener, basically they helped take the lead, helped create a great framework for a great conversation. They brought fun, excitement, maybe new insights, and a connection back and forth between two people. Wow, you're a really good listener. I really appreciate that. They're telling you more than just your listening skills. They're saying you're a good leader in this conversation. You're securing the perimeter. You're helping posit ideas that help me idea generate. And you're listening to them and you're building upon them, right? So I think this is, again, from the theory side, like the total top meta perspective, I think this is what's happening when you're accused of being a good listener, mostly.
I love that you use the word accused of being a good listener. That's an accusation that's an okay one. And to piggyback off of what you just mentioned about being willing to be a leader, I think also being willing to be a follower is good too. Like there's a dance that happens in a conversation, and it's a give and take. And so I think what you mentioned is that it's not even so much that a person has to be a leader in all conversations. It's that they have to be willing to take the lead, and then they also have to be willing to follow. You have to be able to do both, because sometimes the other person wants to take the lead because they've got something that they really need to get off their chest, and they need to be the person who's framing it. And then other times they're struggling with getting what they have to get off their chest, and they need you to take the lead and guide them to that place. So I think it's being able to have the skill of both things.
I look at it, yeah, I agree with you, and I want to push back a little bit on it to say like Piper, our 5-year-old, 6 now, she's going to be 6 in this next month. I am a follower of her. So we have like playtime, and I'll set up a framework of let's go play blocks together. I'm leading the framework, and then inside the framework, she can lead me in moments. Obviously, conversations are like that too. What I'm saying is most people that I run into are terrible conversationalists. They're horrible at it. They're terrible. They don't know how to have a great conversation. They don't know how to listen. They don't know how to talk. Like that's been my experience through life. So what I've done to solve that is I've taken the lead in most conversations. It doesn't mean that I'm always doing all the talking and leading every single moment of the way. It means that I create a container or a leadership framework. And often in those conversations, I am following what's going on, right? But it's very rare I run into somebody that does that for me, takes the lead and creates that container for me. Most of the time, 99% of the time, I'm the one doing that.
Yeah, and when a person does do that, then you're okay with it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's what I mean. Like if a person, I mean, I've been around people who have to be the ones who are in the lead of the conversation. And if you get another person who also feels the same way, now you can't help but be in a competitive frame because now both people are trying to wrestle the conversational power.
I see what you're saying, yeah.
So it's really a matter of being able to take both roles. And I mean, I kind of think that that's all of life, right? It's like it's being able to do all these different things by being flexible enough and adaptable enough. Sometimes you have to be the lead. Sometimes you have to be the follower. Sometimes you have to be optimistic. Sometimes you have to be cynical, right? Like you just, it's being able to be whatever the situation requires of you. So I'm not disagreeing with you at all. I think that taking that leadership frame is a good idea because that is the element that most people need to, brush up on. Most people need to figure out ways to take more leadership. And also, that was a very assertive comment that most people are terrible conversationalists.
It's true, though. I mean, from my experience, it's true. I don't know about you listening.
I'm trying to think.
But my experience is most people aren't really good at knowing how to have like a valuable conversation. They're okay with small talk. And even if they're into something they're really into, you talk to somebody that's got a really high-level skill set. Maybe they're a scientist and they're talking about their craft. They're not very good at contextualizing that for the audience or the person that's listening to them, right? So as a listener, if I want to understand what this scientist is saying, and they're super deep in their topic, I have to take leadership to mine out of them to make it interesting for me to listen, right? Because they're not necessarily good at contextualizing it for somebody that's not in their field, for example. I just picked scientists randomly. But,
sure. Yeah.
And again, this is my experience. I'm overvaluing my experience.
And as harsh as that might sound, I don't think you're wrong. I actually think conversing is also an art that is getting lost. And I think a part of it, I would argue, is that piece that it's difficult to feel uncomfortable. And if we have a real conversation with each other, now we're entering territory that might be upsetting or be offensive. And we really struggle with being okay in those situations. And so I think developing, so being a good conversationalist is being a good persuasive speaker and somebody who is good at communicating. And then also on the receiving end, it's about being a good listener. And both of these are two different skills. And you have to have both of them present to have a really good conversation. And I think both of those things are becoming lost arts. And so I think I'm glad we're focusing on the one that doesn't get as much airplay, which is the listening piece. I think persuasion and communication on the other side gets a little bit more airtime as a general rule. I made a Facebook post. This is a conversation born of a Facebook post I made about how I know when I'm being a shitty listener. And I made 3 qualifiers. And the 3 things I mentioned, and so this is, we've been talking about how to be a good listener, but for me, these are the ways that I know that I've been a bad listener or I'm being a bad listener. And the first one I mentioned is that I can't wait until it's my turn to talk again. I'm just waiting for the person to stop talking so I can talk. And I do that way more often than I should because I'm pretty extroverted and I'm also very bombastic and I'm fairly opinionated and I'm used to being able to monopolize a conversation or at least talk into a microphone. And so I have a tendency, I've noticed that when I'm engaged with another person, I can get into sort of pontificating microphone mode. And I've had to really train myself to not transfer this skill of talking into a microphone for a podcast into my day-to-day life. And nobody wants to be around somebody who's just going to pontificate at them. So that's one of the markers. I'm like, okay, I'm being a pretty bad listener when I'm just waiting for my turn to talk again. I think the second thing that really tells me that I'm not being a very good listener is that I mistakenly assume other people's observations are prescriptions, as in like, when they make a statement about how they see the world, I think they're saying that that's how the world should be.
Like my statement that everybody's a bad listener.
Yeah. Well,
Like if you took that and assumed that that was how I said the world is, instead of that's just my opinion.
Well, I think it's actually closer to something to the effect of, and I recently saw an interview with a person who's a relatively controversial figure, but they kept making assertions about what they think is happening with the world. And the interviewer kept saying, "Oh, you think that's how it should be?" And the person being interviewed kept saying, "Well, no, I don't think that's how it should be. I just believe that that's how it is." And I realized that sometimes I do that too. Like when a person is saying that, like this is what I think is the challenge with relationships, or this is what I think is the challenge with politics, or whatever it is. I'll be like, "Oh, okay, so you think that that's how it should be." And the person's like, "No, I'm just saying that that's how I see it." And so that's the second one. I don't do that nearly as much because I think with introverted thinking as my auxiliary or co-pilot function, I'm a little better about understanding that data is just data. But if I find myself doing that, I know that I'm not actually being a good listener. I'm not actually hearing the message that they're giving. And the third one is that I don't build compassion for the person. And one of my favorite quotes came from a friend of mine a long time ago, my friend Cameron, who said, "If you fully understand another human being, the only thing you can feel for them is compassion." And he's an INTJ. He uses introverted intuition. And I thought that was a really interesting statement, that the only reason why we don't have compassion for other people is usually because we don't understand how what they think or the choices that they're making are an emergent of the system that is running inside of them. Because if we understood the system that's running inside of them and all the complexity of it, then we would understand why all of their thoughts and decisions make complete and total sense to them, and how that's the only thing that could be from that system. Now, that's not to say that people aren't responsible when they make bad decisions and or hurt people. And still, when we understand even that level, we generally, if we fully understand what's going on inside of them, we feel compassion for them, even if we judge their behavior or their thoughts as being negative or destructive. Those are not the same thing. Being able to compartmentalize between disapproving of an individual while still having compassion for them, it's hard to hold both those things at the same time. But the best way to do that is to fully listen, is to really understand the other person. So if I go away from a conversation with vitriol inside of me, or jadedness or a lot of judgment to that person, and I don't have compassion for them, I realize it's because I wasn't really listening. Anyway, the reason why I mention all that is because somebody asked me that how would type go into this? Like, are those personality types that lead with judging or decision-making functions? So all the IPs and EJs, would they have a harder time listening because their judging function would make them want to make quick decisions on what they're hearing, or interrupt to make evaluative, or evaluate as the person is talking, as opposed to having higher openness? And do those that lead with perceiving functions, so those would be like the EPs and the IJs, would they have an easier time of listening because they lead with a perceiving function, which is information gathering or perception, right? And there might be some correlation, but I would not say that that's a one-to-one at all, because there's been some information to come out that the judging function of introverted feeling, or what we call authenticity, it actually goes into a flow state when it's listening to another person's story. Now, as soon as the decision-making function of authenticity or introverted feeling comes to a conclusion and decision, then its listening ability shuts down. But while it hasn't made a decision yet, while it's still ruminating, it actually listens better than any other function does. And then I would argue that some of the perceiving functions have a hard time listening because it requires them to be still and present. Maybe some of the extroverted intuition or extroverted sensing, which are the perceiving functions of all the EPs, they might have trouble listening because it means that they have to stay in one place. And there could be a little bit of restlessness there. So I don't think it's a one-to-one correlation. But that said, I would actually say that listening is more attached to something that goes outside of Myers-Briggs. I would say it probably is more related to something like the Big Five model of openness. I think greater openness, or the ability to be curious and inquisitive to new information, regardless of the person's Myers-Briggs type. I would say openness is probably more correlated. And so this is something that while we might have some wiring that encourages us to go one way or the other, this is, I believe, a skill that, and it doesn't matter what your personality type, I believe it's a skill that anybody can learn. And also, no matter what your personality type is, you could be bad at listening for whatever reason, whatever makes good or bad listening the emergent of the system that is you. It changes from person to person. Regardless, I do think that most people can either develop or even brush up on the skill, because I do think that the world that we're living in discourages us from developing it.
I think that's a good point, that there probably are some type indicators here, some personality types that play into how well somebody is pre-wired to listen or have a challenge around it or be a conversationalist. Or, for me, for example, information moves so slowly in conversation often. I use extroverted intuition as my primary driver in my personality. And often I find conversations moving too slow. And again, that's where I go into the active listening frame, where I take control of the conversation and I still try to listen, but I help direct it so I can get things moving faster. So I'm having a good time too. And the more fun I'm having, the more I'm engaged and the more I'm actually listening. So I look at it as a benefit for both parties. And I would also say that there's one piece in here that you might see yourself as a really great listener. Like the act of listening itself, retaining information, understanding what the other person's saying, have deep empathy, whether it's responsive, passive listening, or more active, directed listening, whatever it is, you might be really good at that. And the other piece of this too is, does the person you're with know that you're good at that? So for example, and you and I have had some struggle with this in the last couple days and weeks, and I won't say how that struggle's come out. You can articulate it if you want. But long story short, there's this idea like if I'm sitting down to talk to somebody and my phone buzzes or rings, I will pick it up and I will mute it or click it so the person sees I'm not answering it, and I'll flip it and put it face down on the table. And then I look right back in their eyes and go, keep going, please. And I don't let it rattle me. Sometimes I won't even break eye contact when that's happening. I'll just pick up the phone, click it, and set it down. I won't even check to see who's calling or texting me. I'll let them finish their thought, come to a complete part of what they're saying, or finish the conversational subject matter, bring it to a close and say, would you mind if I just check to make sure that's not an emergency? And then I frame it and I look at my phone and make sure it's not Antonia calling me, for example, our daughter's hurt or something. And I'm like, oh, nothing important. Okay. And I put my phone back down. I can check those later and I get back into conversation. I don't check it immediately. I let them complete their thought. And we're probably doing this to each other as humans all the time. Like we're doing these little markers of not listening all the time, quote unquote, not listening. We're still listening. It'd be very easy for me to continue listening, just check to make sure there's nothing emergency going on my phone. But that little act sends a signal to the other person. The optics of that is, that they're not, whatever's happening on their phone is more important than me, even if I don't actually answer it, even if I just glance at it. And this is key, because what you're sending the other person also indicates how much you're going to get out of the interchange. If they don't think you're actually listening, they're going to start holding back. I do this to people all the time. If I assume they're not listening to what I'm saying and they're not engaged with the conversation, I start to just not give them very much. I start to find ways to shut the conversation or close it down and move on to the next thing I'm doing, because obviously there's no value here. They're not engaged in what's happening. So what signals are you sending? Not just the actual thing that you're doing with the listening, but what signals are you sending the other person, I think is key too.
Yeah, that would go to that second point in the Harvard Business Review article about interactions that build self-esteem and securing the perimeter. I gave the example of somebody coming up and interrupting it, but our devices interrupt our interactions way more than other human beings do, because other people can see that we're in conversation with somebody else. So people are usually more polite than to just come and tromp on a conversation, but our devices don't know that. And so what's interesting is correlating what you're talking about, which is a kindness and is securing the perimeter, with that building self-esteem in the speaker or the person you're talking to. I found that to be really fascinating. So a great listener is somebody who honors the other person and builds their self-esteem in the conversation by marginalizing all those disruptions.
I've also figured out, and one last thing on a practical level, I've also discovered in the last 5 years, one thing that's helped me have better conversations and the people that I'm talking to feel like there's a deeper intimacy and connection there, is I used to, 10, 15, 20 years ago, I used to be a fairly good conversationalist, but I used to be very question focused. It was almost like an interrogation. I would be that active listener frame, but I'd be asking questions. So what do you mean by that? Unpack that for me. Like I'd ask questions, right? And I'd keep drilling and going further down with these line of questioning. And often that worked, but I learned that if I pepper questions, maybe 3-to-1 ratio, like a one question to 3 statements I posit in the conversation, it creates a conversation that's more intimate. It actually ends up going deeper into topics. So as we're talking and they start sharing maybe something, maybe it's an athlete talking about, I met this athlete once who's a minor league baseball player in Florida on an Uber driver. He was an Uber driver, right? But he played minor league baseball. Instead of saying, so, and I would start out the conversation, so tell me about that. What's that like? And he started talking about minor league baseball. And he shared, how they don't make much money. And instead of saying, well, how much do you make? I said, man, that must be rough. Like, I can't imagine, like I would make a statement like that. I can't imagine that, like not making enough to support myself on that. And it wasn't really a question. I just kind of left it open-ended. And instantly it was like a vacuum. And he jumped in and started answering, yeah, it is tough because of blah, 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 right? It creates almost like this empathy, this connection point. And he feels very listened to because I'm almost stating something in an emotional it could be logical too. It doesn't have to be emotional. I'm stating something to him. And now it's not a question like grilling him or trying to get information. It's I'm showcasing empathy or thought back to him. And now he's able to fill in the gap. When I say it, I end the sentence of a statement of empathy or something I took from it, like, wow, I didn't realize that this, that must be blah, 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 right? And now it's a vacuum for them to fill in on the other side. I think this is a great way that I've learned that I can go get much more intimately with people in get much more intimate with people in conversation than just asking questions alone.
Right, because the statement indicates a universality of experience.
Yeah.
And so the person they don't just feel heard, but they feel validated. But if you just
or invalidated.
Or, yeah.
Sometimes it's risky because like,
true.
Oh, you do this because of this and this, Antonio, right? I make a statement, you're like, well, that's not what I meant. And then we end up in like this argument, right? So it's a little risky too. Because I'm not asking you, I'm positing an idea toward how you're feeling.
Well, if you represent it as you're feeling, though, right? Like, well, I can't imagine that. I would feel blah, 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 blah.
Certainly.
Then you're not necessarily representing how they feel. But if they feel the same, it's very validating to them. And so that's a great way of doing it. I remember one time when we were talking to somebody and we were just asking them questions over and over again. At one point, they just looked at me because we were having dinner. They were like, can I just eat my food? I was like, oh, maybe we're grilling you too hard. And I think that was born, that concept of also offering, because it seems like people would love to talk about themselves. So you just ask question after question. But if you don't offer anything of yourself, you're actually having a one-sided interaction. You're not giving them anything of yourself. And so over a very short amount of time, people recognize that, yeah, this is a one-sided thing. So talking about listening, we just gave our ruminations on the concept and talked about how we think that it's art that's dying, that we think our modern world is taking away our ability to listen, and part of that is because we have a tendency to dehumanize a lot of people that we engage with since we're doing it digitally or virtually, and because we're moving into a soundbite time period where we assume a lot about what the other person is saying with very little information. So having higher degrees of openness, having the ability to really listen to a full statement or a full concept and hear the nuances of the other person's perspective, not just making assumptions about what they think because we've prejudged them based on other criteria, or they said a couple of words that are almost always attached to this concept over here, but letting them complete the thought and hear how they might have subtleties to how they think about it, which are actually more in simpatico with how you think about it. And then being able to cross-pollinate ideas, we believe, is very powerful. Now, Joel also posited that people aren't very good conversationalists. And while that felt like a harsh statement to me in the moment, I kind of might have to agree. And that includes myself. I have not always been a great conversationalist. Like I mentioned, I still have a tendency to wait till people stop talking because then I get to talk, right? And that doesn't make me a very good listener at all. And so we recommend that if you want to increase and improve your ability to listen, then watch for some of the stuff you do. What are the things you're doing? Are you checking your phone a lot? So therefore not building confidence in your speaker? Are you thinking about what you're going to say while they're talking? Are you asking questions to promote discovery and insights, or are you grilling them, right? Are you just trying to solve the problem, or actually listening and building credibility in your listening abilities and then making suggestions? Are you staying present? Are you securing the perimeter? Are you making eye contact when it's appropriate? Are you okay with being uncomfortable? When they say something that's triggering to you, do you throw that back at them? Or are you willing to have some openness and be in an uncomfortable state for a little while. These are some of the things that we feel will really move the needle. And I think the reason why we're so concerned about it is that cross-pollinating ideas is how all progress happens. And if we lose the ability to cross-pollinate, if we lose the ability to truly listen to each other and idea generate, then we'll find ourselves becoming quite regressive because we lose our compassion. And the only way for us to get to the next level is to keep our compassion for each other. We have way too many ways of hurting each other now. Like we can destroy each other and ourselves on a mass level. So the way of the future is compassion. It's the universe's glue. Love is the universe's glue. If we lose the ability to listen, we lose the ability to have compassion, and we lose the ability to keep ourselves going.
I would agree. So you've been a part of this conversation in listening so far, but now it's your turn to talk and actually posit some of your ideas and your opinions and your thoughts. The best place to do that is over at personalityhacker.com. Underneath this podcast, there's a comment area where you can ask questions, you can leave comment, feedback, share your story. I love to hear stories from you listening because when you share your story, we get a unique perspective into your experience. So come over and share what's going on for you. You can also join our community of like minds. We're all over social media. Twitter and Facebook are good places to find us. Twitter.com/personalityhack, HACK. Or Facebook.com/personalityhacker is another place where there's a growing community of like minds. People just like you that want to grow themselves, understand more about their world, and have conversations. So come over and join that community as well.
We're also on Instagram. You can know that because I am unsuccessfully attempting to figure out how to use Instagram. And every once in a while, you'll see me post something where I'm like, is this the thing I'm supposed to do? So we are also on Instagram, Personality Hacker. And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. And if you'd like to know how to support Personality Hacker, one of the best ways to do that is to check out our premium content. Something in there might be right for you on your personal development journey. Check out our premium content at personalityhacker.com and invest in yourself while also helping us continue making podcasts.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.